So, Lone Rider here, and I just want to kind of weigh in on something that I realized over the years following the news, especially recently, which is that there seems to be a lot of people out there who believe that simply being in the right place at the right time, or depending on how you look at it, the wrong place at the wrong time, makes you some kind of an expert. Um, Let me explain. On issues like gun control, for example, we see people put forth as um, sages of policy, people we should listen to, people we should give credence to about all the aspects of the issue, from whether we should pass new laws, whether we should, do this or that or the next thing. And the only real knowledge or experience they seem to have with firearms, one way or the other, is having been in a place where a crime was committed or being the victim of a crime. And, most people have empathy, including myself. So we're going to feel bad for somebody who has been, had something unfortunate happen to them, whether it was, an accident or a deliberate criminal attack or whatever. Whether it's a hurricane, a bridge collapse, or a shooting. These things are awful. People get hurt, people get killed, and they're not, they're tragedies for a reason. And so, you know, that something like that happens to somebody is tragic. But the thing is, do we talk to somebody? Do we take the advice of somebody who happened to just be there when, let's say, a hurricane came and tore up their house? Do we look to them for meteorological advice, for storm planning, for how to maintain, flood control infrastructure, for predicting storms, things like that? No. If they may be interviewed on the news as sort of a human interest story to get their reaction, and famously, reporters can be kind of callous about this. The typical thing is, somebody's house just got totally obliterated. They've lost everything from their family albums to, maybe their family pet, to maybe even a family member. And the reporter sticks a microphone in their face and says, "So, how does it feel?" You know, and there have been a couple incidents where that's happened, and people have, said to the reporter, "Well, how do you think it feels?" Which I think we can all empathize with as well, because at some level, we all know what it's like to have bad stuff happen to us, whether it's something on a much smaller scale or whether it's a life-altering event like your house being blown up by a tornado or a hurricane. But the point is, just because somebody was the victim of, let's say, a hurricane, doesn't make them a meteorological expert, doesn't make them an expert on, building levees and things like that. The only thing they have to offer is their personal experience, which, is important to consider, but which doesn't really tell you what to do about preventing something like that in the future. All it really informs anyone of is the personal or emotional cost of that particular tragedy as it impacted them. So, if somebody, Mrs. Smith is living and minding her own business, and a hurricane comes and destroys her house and washes away everything and tears the roof off, she has a story to tell. She has an experience to share, but she doesn't have the answers about how to predict the next one or how to build better flood control infrastructure or anything like that. Simply being the victim of a hurricane doesn't make her an expert in hurricanes. If you have somebody who's under a bridge and the bridge falls down and they survive the bridge collapse, they're going to walk away from that. That may be the most dramatic thing that ever happened to them in their life. And they may be saying to themselves, "Oh my God, this is awful." And it's definitely going to have an impact on them. And they're definitely going to walk away thinking, "Well, that was bad. We don't want bridges to fall down on people and hurt or kill them. So what can we do in the future to prevent this?" And they're going to be asking a lot of questions, perhaps, just like the person whose house got destroyed by the hurricane might be asking a lot of questions. but they're not necessarily going to have the answers, right? Having a bridge collapse on you doesn't turn you into a structural engineer. This should be obvious. The fact that I have to point it out, well, it shows that I don't think a lot of people understand things like what in philosophy is called epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. The fact that, simply being somewhere where something happens doesn't magically confer on you all the knowledge you need to address all the various particulars of that issue. And this should be obvious. I mean, knowledge comes from research and learning and hard work. It doesn't just magically happen to you. You don't just wake up one day an expert on something. Now, a tragedy of some kind could spur somebody to learn about the particulars related to it. If I survive a bridge collapse, again, it's going to be a pretty, big event in my life. I may therefore find myself trying to wrap my mind around it as part of that, as part of dealing with it and trying to understand it, and maybe also feel like I'm doing something productive as a result of that. I may very well start learning about bridges and about structural engineering. I may get a book out of the library. I may talk to anybody I know who happens to be in the engineering field. I may attend, a town meeting if it was, let's say, a local bridge, where they're talking about exactly what went wrong. I may do some research, etc. And at the end of the day, I might find myself, if not an expert, I may find myself knowledgeable enough as either a budding expert or even just an educated layman that I can look at it and offer some suggestions and say, aha, maybe that's what went wrong. But I don't wake up in the hospital the day after the bridge collapse with all that knowledge magically infused into my head. I have to go out and learn it. The only thing the bridge collapse will do is provide a motivation for me to learn about that sort of thing and all the attendant various issues related to it. So, if somebody is a victim of a tragedy, whether it's a crime or whether it's some kind of just accident or disaster, that can be something that spurs them to become an expert. But simply being the victim of that particular thing does not make them an expert. They don't wake up in the hospital recovering from their injuries with magical knowledge, infused into their brain. Okay. And the fact that anybody should have to point this out, like I said, I think we've kind of walked a long way away from an understanding of knowledge and again, what in philosophy is called epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. This used to be something that everybody pretty much understood, at least at a basic level. If I want to learn how to fix car stereos, I have to actually learn how to fix car stereos, right? I don't just wake up one day with the ability to do so. If I want to be a watchmaker, I got to go to school and learn how to do that, right? And if I want to be a good bike mechanic, I got to spend, I've been a cyclist for 20 years, and I've spent a good part of that wrenching on my own bikes. Now, in recent years, a lot of that time has been spent working with people who know better than me about bikes and have been doing it for even longer. And some of them are expert mechanics. A friend of mine runs a bike shop, and I've learned a great deal from him. I'm still nowhere near as knowledgeable about bikes as he is, but I know a lot more than the layman, and I know a lot more than, somebody who's just started to learn. The difference is I've been doing it for 20 years, and I still don't have all the answers, not about bikes or anything else. So the point is, you have to learn about something to know about it. You can't just, it's not just like, boom, I have magical knowledge. It doesn't work like that in the real world. And I think we all seem to understand that when it comes to things like learning how to fix watches, learning how to fix car stereos, learning how to be a carpenter, learning how to be a bike mechanic, or even, surviving a bridge collapse or a hurricane. I mean, there's a reason that when there's a hurricane and it's being reported on in the news, they'll go and they'll talk to the survivors to get an idea of the effect of the hurricane. But when it comes to talking about the science of meteorology that caused that effect and maybe how to minimize the damage from the next one with better predictions or flood controls or whatever, what do? They go to the meteorologists. They go to the Army Corps of Engineers, whomever it is. They go, in other words, to the people who actually have spent a lifetime learning about that particular thing. Now, this isn't to say that public discourse should be limited only to experts, especially since a lot of times it's very easy to have people who pretend to be experts but aren't. If all you're doing is looking at, well, whether somebody is a declared expert or not, essentially it's a philosophical fallacy called appeal to authority. Because all you're doing, well, such and such is true because so-and-so says it is, not because of the facts they're stating in and of itself. So I'm certainly not suggesting that, just because you're a layman, you shouldn't be allowed to comment on an issue, or your comments shouldn't be given any credence. But what I am saying is that they should be given the credence that's appropriate to them. And in many cases, yes, a person who survives a bridge collapse and off the top of their head has suggestions to offer about how to build a safer bridge in the future, he should be free to speak his mind and vent and say whatever he's going to say. But that doesn't mean that anything he says is going to make any fracking sense. Fairly straightforward. We seem to understand this when it comes to things like learning a skill, or, again, things like hurricanes and bridge collapses. When we trip up on it is when it comes to things like firearms. Okay, when there's a school shooting or some horrible mass shooting or other crime, especially in recent years, in the last year or two, you see a huge tendency to just trot out all the people who were there at the time, and it's almost as if we should just treat them as if they're suddenly now experts on everything related to that issue because they happened to be there when something bad went down, or they happened to have been the victim of a crime. And I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that. I'm going to feel bad for them, just like I'd feel bad for the person whose house got flattened by the hurricane, or the guy who lived through a bridge collapse. But the difference is, just like I probably wouldn't take the advice of an ignorant layman on how to build a bridge just because he happened to be there when one fell down, probably also not going to take the advice from a 16-year-old kid that was hiding under a desk during a shooting on what gun laws and gun policy and all the various peripherals surrounding that should be. We can start with the fact that a lot of these people don't know anything about guns at all. This is the only time they've had any interaction with them. So, something as simple as, well, what kind of guns are they talking about? Now, a gun control advocate or somebody with a different view than me might look at this and say, well, you don't have to know much about guns to know that they're dangerous if they're misused. If that's what the gun control advocates were arguing, that would be perfectly true. It's a gun, it shoots a bullet, it's dangerous if you get shot with it, etc. That's not what they're saying. They're not saying we should ban these guns because they're guns and they fire a bullet. They're usually saying we should ban or restrict a particular type of firearm because of how it works or other features it has. For example, they'll describe a semi-automatic civilian rifle as a military-style assault rifle. And they'll say nobody should have a military-style assault rifle that's designed for the battlefield. Here's the problem. A civilian semi-automatic rifle isn't a select-fire military-style assault rifle. It just isn't. The fact that somebody's going to say it is, they're either disingenuous or they just don't know any better. They haven't learned. Either way, we shouldn't be taking their advice on what gun policy should be because they don't know anything about the subject upon which they wish to regulate. More importantly, because they don't know anything about the subject they wish to regulate, they also don't know what its existing legal status is. If somebody's going to say to me, the laws that regulate X, whatever X is, could be coffee beans, it could be rifles. If somebody's going to come to me and say the laws that regulate X should be stricter, then they should at least know what the laws that regulate X already are, right? Or how else do they know they need to be stricter? Stricter than what? The problem is, with firearms, a lot of the degree of regulation is based on what type of gun it is and how it works. So an actual military-style assault rifle that has a select fire capability is regulated much more strictly than a civilian semi-automatic sporting rifle. So if that's really what you're worried about, it's already not easy to get them, and they're already very heavily regulated. Now, if you're talking about regular semi-automatic civilian rifles, those are less heavily regulated, but that's not the term you're using. So you're either confused or you're disingenuous. But the point is, anybody who knows even a little bit about the subject is going to hear this and they're going to say, well, again, either they're confused or disingenuous. But the point is, either way, the person, if they don't understand the type of guns involved, they also don't understand the laws involved, because those a lot of times are related to what type of gun it is and how it works. So therefore, if they don't know what the given restrictions already are for a particular type of firearm, how do they know they should be stricter? Stricter than what? And this is the problem with basing, with basing determinations about who you should listen to on an experience they underwent. By all means, listen to the survivors of a horrible crime or other tragedy to get an idea of the personal and emotional impact. But when you're considering the advice that those people are then going to offer up on changes to society and law that you should make, consider that they don't know anything about those. And, there's a lot of stuff when it comes to something like gun control. It's not just about guns and their use in crime and the efficacy or lack thereof of a potential law that's being considered. There's a lot of other things. There's constitutional issues involved as well. Whatever you think of the Second Amendment right to bear arms, even if we disregard that entirely, which I don't think you should, but even if we did, you have the Fourth and Fifth Amendments and other protections against unreasonable searches and seizures and people coming into your home and things like that. How would you declare an entire class of property illegal without hearings and compensation and all of that stuff? That would undermine a huge aspect of our constitutional rights as civilians. Whatever you think of the Second Amendment, there's other things involved. There's the issue of how would it be enforced. We know from New York with stop and frisk that racial aspects came into play. Racial profiling was a big thing with the stop and frisk program, which of course was instituted to what? Enforce gun control laws. Now, the ultimate irony was a lot of the same people who were saying we need to take the guns away from everybody were also the ones who started, complaining to the heavens about racial profiling when they actually tried to do that. I guess the point is you can't have your cake and eat it too, or that this is what gun control means. You say, well, we want to get rid of a particular type of gun, or we don't want people to have a particular type of item. Passing a law doesn't magically make things disappear. You have to actually do something to make them disappear. You have to enforce that law. What does that mean? You have to be willing to employ tactics, in the case of something like gun control, that are going to be objectionable for reasons other than violating people's firearms rights. You're going to have to violate people's right to privacy. You're going to have to perhaps single people out unfairly, maybe based on race. Or at least there's a possibility that could happen. And all of these things, whether there's an actual racial bias or whether it's just unconscious, whether it's just sort of, it just sort of happens, or whether it's deliberate. The point is that's another thing to consider. Is this law going to have, an impact on certain segments of society more than others? Is that going to be fair? How about just how do you balance the constitutional issues of, on one hand, you're trying to prevent bad people from getting their hands on weapons. On the other hand, you don't want to, hopefully, violate the rights of the good people. How do you manage that? What's going to be the impact on law-abiding firearms owners, who you have to consider because there are millions of them out there. You may not like them. You may think they're all a bunch of jerks. But the point is, if you don't consider the millions and millions of people that are going to be affected by your law, you're really not thinking it through, or you're just really callous. So, there are huge legal, constitutional, civil rights, pragmatic, sociological, and other issues involved that go beyond just a particular proposal and the facts about a particular type of firearm and stuff like that. People who spend their whole lives studying firearms, studying criminology, studying constitutional law, haven't been able to convince everybody that there's one solution to this problem. it's disingenuous to tell me, who knows a little bit about the issue, that a 16-year-old hiding under a desk, terrified out of his or her wits during a shooting, managed to solve all of these major issues which have plagued this country for years in 5 seconds. Well, hiding under a desk and, surviving a traumatic experience. So it would be nice if that were the case, but somehow I don't think so. Okay, and so, to put it in a nutshell, by all means, listen to people who are the victims of a tragedy to get an idea of the impact of that tragedy. That's what they have to offer. But unless that tragedy spurs them to actually go out and do some hard research and learn some facts, they're not experts on anything except being scared out of their wits and undergoing an unpleasant experience or a traumatic experience. And okay, we can respect that as people who do know a little bit about the issue, whether we're gun owners or gun control proponents or not. But the point is that at the end of the day, do you want firearms policy? Do you want gun control? Do you want your constitutional rights? Do you want your civil rights? Do you want issues that might be pregnant with things like racial profiling to be steered by what? Somebody who doesn't literally know anything about the issue other than what it's like to unfortunately run afoul of the wrong end of a gun held by a maniac? Again, that's like going to meteorological and flood planning advice to Billy Bob, whose house got torn up by a hurricane, just because he happened to have his house got torn up by a hurricane. Not only may he not be a meteorologist, I mean, you don't know anything else about him. He may have never finished high school. You're going to go to him for meteorological advice and infrastructure planning for flood control? Same thing here, okay? If I survive a bridge collapse, it does not make me a structural engineer. It makes me somebody who survived a bridge collapse. That by itself doesn't give me knowledge that I have to impart about the building of a better and safer bridge in the future. All it makes me knowledgeable of is what goes wrong when a particular bridge isn't safe in that particular instance. And, it would pay for us to remember this. Right now, there's a lot of people out there who seem to think that you instantaneously acquire knowledge just by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or they know that's not the case, but they're just hoping you won't call them out on it because then they'll say, oh, you're meanies and you're not respecting these kids and what they went through. Look, by all means, listen to the victims of a tragedy, whether it's a hurricane, a bridge collapse, or a school shooting. But after you're done listening to the tearful stories of the survivors, turn to somebody who actually knows something about the issue for your solution. Right? And you know what? That could be a survivor. If somebody survives a horrible incident and it spurs them to learn about the subject and do some research, they may well be the one to come up with the solution. But the idea that you're going to survive some horrible tragedy and then wake up in the hospital with all the answers to the problems with the world, that doesn't happen, okay? That's the fantasy comic book solution, okay? That's somebody gets struck by lightning or mutated by glowing ooze and wakes up one day with superpowers. That's not how it works in the real world. In the real world, knowledge takes hard work and effort and time and discipline. And you have to, an emotional experience might convince you to go out and seek that knowledge, but you have to still go out and seek it. Just surviving some horrible tragedy doesn't make you an expert on anything except surviving a horrible tragedy. You want to save the world? Great. But you got to earn it, okay? And until you do, a lot of us who know even a little bit about these issues aren't going to be all that willing to listen to you, all right? We're certainly not going to be all that willing to throw our constitutional rights under the bus on the hope that maybe, in spite of all evidence, you actually know what you're talking about. So, if you really care, go out there and do some research and learn something, and then get back to me. Lone Rider out.